Welcome to the Archive Room podcast.
The Nation Station, Manx Radio.
Fastamai, I'm Judith Lay, and I'm very pleased to find you waiting for me at the door to the Archive Room, the place where we keep stories of island life in years gone by, told by the people who were there. So come on in, sit down and make yourself comfortable, and let's listen to this week's selection. In the Archive Room this week, I found a big anniversary, a teacher taking on the Territorial Army, and a leading Manx advocate with some fascinating memories of his early years. So let's get started. 44 years ago, in 1980, the Isle of Man Steam Packet Company celebrated its 150th anniversary. A perfect moment for David Collister to sit down with Director and General Manager Sydney Shimmin, who joined the Steam Packet Company in the 1930s and had so many stories to share.
I gather that the first journey was by a boat called Mona's Isle the First. It was on the 16th of August 1830. It went from Douglas to Liverpool. Have we any record of how many passengers travelled on her or how long the journey took?
In fact, the first journey was on the 14th of August, not the 16th. That's why our birthday is the 14th. This is when the ship left the shipbuilding yard in the Clyde and came to Douglas. The next day it took the directors and stockholders on an excursion to the Menai Straits in North Wales, and then the following morning it did the first sail to Liverpool. 32 passengers were on board. The speed of the vessel, 8.5 knots, so the time on passage would be about 9 hours.
Yes, that's a pretty good time, really. Yeah. Now, the Mona's Isle Company, which was later to become the Steam Packet, had, I gather, a major rival in those days, the St. George Company. Apparently they'd race the boats to and fro to outdo each other on the sort of minutes saved on the journeys.
Yes, this is true. It seemed a bit ridiculous when you look at it now that we're talking in terms of saving 2 minutes on passage, etc., but it was intense rivalry. But the story that I rather like concerns probably the most famous captain that the Steam Packet ever employed, Captain Gill, who obviously was an extremely astute seaman. And one evening, sensing that there would be a southwest gale the next day, he worked his crew all night and shifted all the coal to the bunkers on the windward side of the vessel, so that the vessel had a list to port. When he sailed the next day, there was a southwest gale, and the effect of the wind was to put the vessel on an even keel, so he got maximum of efficiency from both paddle boxes and actually made the journey 3 hours quicker than his rival.
Well, he was quite a captain, that fellow.
He really was.
I suppose it's not fair to say, but you wouldn't get fellas like doing that sort of thing today, would you?
Wouldn't get the men to do it.
No. This vessel, the St. George, the competitor of yours, came to a rather sticky end, didn't she?
Yes. Actually, they both vessels came to Douglas, and an easterly gale was imminent, so Captain Gill took the Mona's Isle out well off into the sea and anchored her for the night. But for some reason, the captain of the St. George, a Lieutenant Tudor RN, decided to anchor in Douglas Bay. Well, the inevitable happened. He snapped his anchor cable. The ship was pounded onto Conister rocks and broken up. And it's interesting here that William Hilary, who at that time lived in what afterwards became the Fort Anne Hotel and has recently been demolished, witnessed all this happening, got some volunteers together, and despite the atrocious weather, rowed out to Conister Rock and rescued all the crew. Within 2 years, he'd built on Conister Rock what is now known as the Tower of Refuge, and the name, of course, is self-explicit. But then he went on further and became the founder of the Royal National Lifeboat Institution.
As a result, almost directly, of that particular incident.
I'm sure.
Yeah. In the event, then, the St. George Company withdrew. They left your predecessors, I suppose, with a monopoly for some time. But throughout the early years, there seemed to have been quite a lot of competitors who couldn't really stand the pace for very long. They came and they went, didn't they?
Yes, there were masses of them in and out. The Isle of Man and Liverpool Steam Packet in 1836 and 37, and they then went into liquidation. And then in 1853, a group of Ramsey businessmen decided to form the Ramsey Steamship Company. Castletown was the capital at that time, and in 1854 some businessmen in Castletown said, well, why should Ramsey and Douglas have a shipping service and not us? So they formed one. Both these companies eventually amalgamated to try and fight the main rival, the Steam Packet Company, but both in fact lost a lot of money, and within a couple of years they sold their boats to Cunard. They went down into the Mediterranean and they disappeared from the scene.
Even back as far as 1887, there was a company known as Manx Line.
Yes, this is quite true. It was really an outcome of the shipyard Fairfields, who built two fine vessels on spec, hoping to sell them to the steam packet, called the Prince of Wales and the Queen Victoria. But the steam packet apparently were not in the market for more ships at that time. So a group of English businessmen bought the ships and set them up in opposition to the company. There was fierce rivalry, fares were slashed down to ridiculous levels, and in the 2 ensuing years, the steam packet just failed to break even, but Manx Line lost an awful lot of money, and as a consequence, they went into liquidation and the Steam Packet Company acquired the two vessels.
Of course, all the early ships' boats were paddle steamers, weren't they? How would the travel on those compared with that of today? Have you got any record, for instance, of accommodation and the facilities that were available?
Well, in the early days, the travel conditions were rough, of course, because there were no lounges or deck housings. You were either in the open on deck or you were battened below decks if the weather was bad.
Yeah.
There were no stabilisers, of course. This company I mentioned to you, the Ramsay Steamship Company, the name of their vessel, incidentally, was Manx Ferry. I think ferry had a different connotation in those days. But it was describing the accommodation, and in the lower lounge there were two colossal stained glass windows, one depicting Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, and the other Shakespeare's Tempest. I don't see the Tempest was very appropriate.
No. You came into the steam packet in the late 1930s. How many vessels were in use when you joined the company?
There were 16 at that time.
Yes.
But of course, some of those were only on service for maybe 4 weeks of the summer. They would come out of dock at Barrow just before Glasgow Fair in the middle of July, and they would lay up in the middle of August.
Were there any particular queens in that lot?
Oh, yes, indeed. There was a Mona's Queen, which she was really my favourite ship at that time, and has remained that she was
all through the time.
She was the one that we lost at Dunkirk, regrettably.
You've lived through these two World War situations with all the boats. The steam packet vessels in both wars indeed got drafted in for war service, did they not?
Oh yes, the Lords of the Admiralty called the ships up, in fact, even several days before war was declared, when it was obviously imminent, and regrettably, in both World Wars, we lost 4 ships.
Were there any particular deeds of daring that are recorded by the ships?
Well, I've found that seamen are a very modest race, and these stories don't get told. I do know, for instance, that at D-Day, the Lady of Man and the Ben Macree were both the headquarters ships for assault flotillas of American commandos. The Old Victoria was at the Arromanches beachhead, which saw one of the most intense fighting. But also that brings you to Dunkirk, which was, of course, preceded it, and the ships were all very much involved there. I think the mere fact that one OBE, several DSCs and a couple of DSMs were awarded the crews of the vessels is proof positive that there were deeds of daring.
Yes.
And one interesting little statistic there was that of all the men who were rescued from the Dunkirk beaches, 1 in 14 travelled on an Isle of Man Steam Packet Company vessel.
That's a good record, isn't it?
Sydney Shimmin, General Manager of the Isle of Man Steam Packet Company, sharing memories of their involvement in the Second World War. There'll be more stories from Sydney Shimmin in a few minutes, but let's hear now from advocate and prominent Manxman Martin Moore, whose grandfather, Ramsay Bignell Moore, was the island's first full-time Attorney General. Martin was only 7 when the Second World War broke out, but has some very clear memories of those years.
The earliest memory is the bombing attack on Ballymena Hospital, which put a stick of bombs from Sir George's Bridge to the far end of Balnard Road. It did some damage. Our memories of that, because we lived in Balnard Road, which was then out in the country. We weren't in the borough of Douglas at that stage. And the memories of the squads of German prisoners of war under military escort of one old soldier carrying a First World War 303 rifle, going out to the farms, and at the end of a harvest day coming back, and I have this memory of a German carrying the gun because it was too heavy for the old soldier. But they were good times, and the people they farmed well. The only problems that they had that I'm aware of, there was one house which was for the Nazi sympathisers, and some of them were quite fearsome, apparently. And at the bottom of Ingerbrecht, by the reservoir, by the dam head, on the mountainside above it, they decided to get these people to plant potatoes. It was food for the nation, and of course the population virtually doubled, and we fed them all. And grandfather's, one of his great upsets was that they sabotaged the crop by knocking all the eyes off the spuds.
Oh, no.
Which upset my grandfather a great deal. But of course I go on to my experience. I mean, I was very familiar with Half Douglas Promenade being used for military encampments and training centres, a lot of troops and military about on the island. And then the Victory in Europe parade. For some reason, we were all invited down, and we were in the Sefton watching the parade go by. Wonderful.
Tell us a bit more about that. What was it, in fact, that Victory Parade?
Well, it was contingents of all the troops, and there was a fly past from Ronaldsway with the Polish and Czech squadrons. And it was strange, later on my father came back during the war as the opening officer of RAF Andreas, stationed at Derby.
Martin Moore with childhood memories of the war years on the island. And in a few moments, we'll hear a little bit about Martin's early years as a Manx advocate. But right now, I think it's time for us to have a suitably nostalgic commercial break.
Your mother goes far too fast on her broomstick, especially with all that woodworm.
I know. I've told her to go down to EB Christian's for a new Fiesta. It's the ideal car for her.
Hang about. She must have been down already. Look, she's coming back. Oh, no. She's bought a Sierra Cosworth.
Why don't you fly down to EB's and see the new features the Ford range can offer?
By Jingo, it's bingo time at Celtic Trader with the following bingo specials. Andrex toilet rolls, just 45 pence. Heinz tomato soup, 23.5 pence. 1 litre of Mazola oil, just 79 pence. 6 Oxo cubes, 19 pence. And chef corned beef, the 12-ounce size, now only 85 pence. All these and more can be won instantly in-store at Celtic Trader of St Paul Square, Ramsey in the Onken Shopping Centre.
So low in price we are, so near, so far.
A little bit of nostalgic advertising from the archive room. Martin Moore was admitted to the Manx Bar in 1962. He'd been a student in his father's office, and it was generally thought that's where he'd return and remain. But Martin wanted to make his own way as an advocate.
And what better to join up with Eric Farger and Jack Corrin here in Dickinson's in Douglas.
Yeah.
Eric had been a student of my grandfather's at the end of the First World War. I had a great partnership with Jack and Eric.
Can you recall the first work that you had to do then?
I'd actually, as a student, sat in the Attorney General's office. Father was wanting to show me things. And the first unpaid job was to draft for him memorandum and articles, the rules and regulations to set up Radio Manx Limited.
Really?
I had to go and look and see what they were doing in the UK.
But, there wasn't much to go on then, because there was only the BBC and Radio Luxembourg. There was no such thing as a commercial radio station in the UK.
It was quite hard to pull it together, but I'm glad to say it stood the test of time. You learnt a lot, and you were into their group very early on, and they were prepared to help. I've never forgotten a senior partner. I rang up, there'd been a minor error in some deed. Come up, fella, and have a cup of tea. So I went up and we had a cup of tea, and all put to bed, sorted out, no problem. And I said, thank you very much. He said, don't thank me. He said, it won't be long before I'm Dad to see you. And I thought, here's this very senior advocate, very friendly, and yes, in due time he came down to see me. Today the bar is much bigger. I knew all the advocates up until the period I ceased to be president of the Law Society, which is now quite a number of years ago.
Yeah. Now, when you first came back, you wouldn't see a woman in these offices at all, would you? You'd hardly see a woman on a jury, would you?
There were no lady Manx advocates till Claire Folds was admitted. Mm-hmm. The whole court system didn't facilitate ladies.
Why not?
They hadn't got the toilet facilities for them, or the changing rooms, because you have to have a robing room.
Yeah, right.
And it was only when Claire was appointed and they changed the Jury Act that they made alterations to the old courthouse here in Athol Street.
Martin Moore, former president of the Isle of Man Law Society and chairman of Manx National Heritage Trustees, talking there with David Collister, a conversation we'll come back to in a future programme. Irene Shimmin is a wonderful storyteller, and in earlier programmes we've enjoyed hearing her talk about her teaching career that began in the 1950s and the fun that she had training a troupe of majorettes who were not only a popular attraction in the Douglas Carnival each year, but were happy to join in events all over the island. It was whilst Irene was looking for a new rehearsal venue for her majorettes that she became involved in something completely different.
And we used to practice every week at St Andrew's Hall. And then we had to get out of there, and I can't think why, I can't remember why. So I was looking for somewhere big enough where we could train, and I ended up at the drill hall, which was perfect. And at that time, the officer in charge of the TA, Territorial Army girls, had left, and they were without an officer. So the sergeant said to me, well, would you be interested? I said, well, I'll give it a go. So I became the officer commanding the Isle of Man Independent Platoon, Women's Royal Army Corps, and I couldn't even salute. But they sent me on a course to the WRAC School of Instruction. So I went. And I turned out to be the best at drill because of the drum majorettes. I was really good there, you know. And they showed me how to drive a tank, which I'm sure was very useful. And we did all this, and it was great fun. My establishment was only 24. That's as many as I could have, you see, and just myself and a sergeant. The sergeant was regular army paid. You see, the same thing with the men. I started off as a second lieutenant, and with 3 months I was a captain. I don't know how I did that. Very rapid promotion. I think I was so old because I was pushing 40 then. I didn't know what to do with me. And it was Colin Savage was the colonel in charge of the men's platoon. So we worked side by side. And I had what was called a general duties platoon. So they cooked and they manned the medical centre office and they did things like that, secretarial, while the men went off to fight or whatever they were supposed to be doing.
So the girls didn't go out on exercises?
Oh, we did, yes, because they used to cook out in the field. We used to cook.
Where did you go for those things?
The range out at the Santon somewhere we went. Goodness me.
Weekend camps and that?
That's right, yes, we did. And every year we went across to a camp. We did all that there. The whole regiment would be there. Dear me, that was very, very impressive indeed. I always remember I used to meet this regimental sergeant major striding across the parade ground, and I didn't know whether to curtsy or salute him. Very, very terrifying figure. Yeah.
Was yours just a purely voluntary position then, or did you get some payment?
You got paid for a whole day Sunday training, and I got paid if you went to camp. That's the only thing I've ever been paid for my volunteer. I've never been paid for anything. No. Never. So that was my Territorial Army experience. I was in the TA for 5 years, and then it was disbanded in 1967.
Right.
It's what I call my brief but spectacular military career, but it was great fun.
So really this sort of ability to control a group of people was probably the way they saw you as the commandant for...
Always been bossy. Always been bossy, you know.
What was your highest rank that you made then?
Captain.
Captain.
If we hadn't been disbanded, who knows? Just who knows?
Irene Shimmin talking about her time in the Territorial Army. And I've got still more stories for you from Irene for a future visit to the archive room. But now we're going back to sea, returning to David Collister's interview with Sydney Shimmin, General Manager of the Isle of Man Steam Packet Company, recorded in 1980 when the Steam Packet was celebrating its 150th anniversary. It was also the year when Connery Chapel published a book, Island Lifeline, all about the history of the Steam Packet Company.
It has some marvellous illustrations, really, of the ships which were built particularly between the wars, with beautiful polished wooden handrails and staircases and decorations and so on. They seem to be vastly superior to the boats we travel in today.
Well, I wouldn't agree with vastly superior. I would say that they certainly looked much more lavish.
They were stylish, weren't they?
Yes, but the explanation for that is that in the last 15 to 20 years, the powers that be have become very, very fire conscious. If I tell you now that if you were building a ship in America, you've got to get a special dispensation to put one piece of wood into the ship. Everything must be metal. They're not quite as strict as that in England, but nevertheless, wooden staircases as we used to know them, they're completely out. Everything now has got to be steel. And even on our modern ships, a lot of what you see that looks like wood, in fact, is not wood. It's a material called maronite, which will not burn. And this is really why there's been this change. It's for the safety angle point of view, following their experience of fires at sea.
Yes. Does that apply to the bigger things like the Queen Mary's and all that sort of?
That goes right through.
Yeah.
That goes right through. The same regulations for everyone.
There's something which I didn't know, and probably quite a lot of listeners didn't know. that the Steam Packet Company for a while in the 30s and 40s dabbled a bit in air travel.
It was in 1935 that the Isle of Man Steam Packet Company, the London, Midland and Scottish Railway Company and Ollie Airlines got together and put up the finance to start Isle of Man air services. Subsequently, Ollie backed out and the Steam Packet and the LMS continued to run the services. And these, in fact, continued up to the end of 1947. They didn't make any profits, they made losses every year, but the traffic was gradually increasing. Then in January 1948, the socialist government in power in England brought in the Air Nationalisation Act, and the nationalised company made it abundantly clear that they weren't going to tolerate a small operator and they'd run us off the air, or whatever you might call it.
Yeah.
So they made an offer to buy us out. It meant that we got our original investment and a small interest back, so this is how we ceased being in air services. We wanted to be in it, and I'm sure we were glad we were in it, and we were sorry that we had to get out when we did.
As a passenger, I sort of strolled out the boat just a few minutes before 9 o'clock, or I get on with the car or whatever. I presume there's got to be an enormous amount of work going on quite a number of hours ahead of sailing. Could you sort of tell us briefly what would be involved by the staff before an embarkation takes place?
Yes, indeed. There are three departments: the engineering department, the catering department, the deck department, and they all have their own tasks. The engineering side will start first. If we take a steam turbine, at 6 o'clock in the morning, the pumps and the heaters to warm the fuel are turned on. At about 8 o'clock, the steam valves are opened. The prop shafts are turned slowly, about 5 revs a minute, to ensure that the turbines warm up properly. The catering staff, meanwhile, are about getting breakfast for the crew, preparing the lounges, preparing the private cabins, taking deliveries of fresh food supplies, etc. The deck ratings come out at about 7 o'clock. Their first duty is to take in some of the extra moorings that are put out at night, move the ship from her night berth into her embarkation berth, put the car ramp and the gangways on board. Then the mail arrives. That is stored in the mail room, and then loading commences of cars and passengers at 8 o'clock.
This archive conversation between David Collister and Steam Packet General Manager Sydney Shimmin was recorded 44 years ago. But some topics, for example, the quality of service that the company provides, the state of summer weather and the national economy, never seem to change.
We have ever recognised in the Steam Packet that we've got a national as well as a commercial responsibility. And I think the proof of this is in the fact that we have over all these years maintained a winter daily service when the paucity of traffic really doesn't justify it. And then we move on to the summer. We are the only company that I know of that, whilst it could manage its basic needs with about 4 ships, in fact carries a fleet of 8 to cater for the summer peaks. If we didn't do this, tourism would suffer. It's not done anywhere else.
Now, can we just come to this year now, because we've been hearing the cry, maybe it's regular, but we've been hearing it very much more forcibly this year, I think, from the hoteliers and the boarding house keepers and so on, that we're having a dreadful season, it can't compare with last year and so on, we must write it off. How have you found it? Is the picture as bad as everyone's painted it?
Well, certainly we're not going to break any records this year. We've got to recognise the world is in recession, all industries are affected, and tourism is an industry. All the resorts in the British Isles are suffering, and the Isle of Man can be no exception to this. We also have to remember that 1978 was a good season for the Isle of Man, and 1979, with the big build-up of Millennium, was an even better one. I would think that 1980, and when I'm talking here, bear in mind, I'm only talking about the Steam Packet arrivals. I don't know about the arrivals of air or other people.
Yeah.
I would think that we will be showing a drop of about 8% on our staying visitors. But where we really are suffering this year is on the day excursion traffic. The reasons for this are the recession, because the people in the early part of the season just were not in Blackpool or Llandudno for us to bring them to the Isle of Man. And then when they did arrive, we run into this terrible spell of weather. And of course, people will only come when the weather's fine. So I would say that probably our day excursion traffic will be down something of the order of 25,000, which is a very big loss to the economy of the Isle of Man.
And this might be a good moment for another vintage commercial. I'm not entirely sure of the details, but the Tourist Board was certainly doing their best to interest autumn holiday makers.
Here's a special message to all our listeners who are not lucky enough to live in the beautiful Isle of Man. Have you got any holidays left this year? If so, why not come over and visit our lovely island? Don't just sit there saying you can't afford it. Find out. We'll help. Just send us a postcard. The address is Manx Radio, Douglas Head, Isle of Man. We'll send you a superb full-colour brochure with a free holiday happiness computer showing how you can save up to half of your travel costs this September. That's right, up to 50% saving. And all you need to do is send a postcard to Manx Radio. In fact, you could even telephone. The number is 0624 24 336. That's 0624 24 336. We'll see that you cross the sea to discover the autumn loveliness of the beautiful Isle of Man.
In conclusion, Steam Packet Company General Manager Sydney Shimmin was keen to pay tribute to the company's biggest assets.
I'm only the 11th general manager in the whole history of the company. But during that time, the company has employed literally thousands of people. They are a most loyal staff. No general manager could ask for more, and I'm proud to be their leader.
And in the year 1980, Sydney Shimmin made this prediction.
The cost of oil is going up colossally now. Is that going to force shippers back to coal burners, do you think?
Well, I think in addition to the cost is going to be the natural shortage of oil.
Yeah.
And already they are building coal-fired ships in Australia. In fact, only last week I saw a picture of a small vessel they launched in Japan with collapsible sails on it. The experts are predicting that by the year 2000, most of the ships at sea will be coal-fired again.
Back to coal. Interesting, that.
And I'll have more interesting and amusing stories to share with you if you join me at the same time next week in the archive room. But for now, let's turn off the lights and close the door. I'm Judith Lay saying thank you for listening and wishing you a very good evening.